Michael and I have been friends for absolute years. We've known each other from a basis of history. And that's why I'm thrilled that he has undertaken the responsibility of setting some of his thoughts down in this book, In Defense of Civilization, How Our Past Can Renew Our Present. History has coursed through this man's veins. We have drunk at the same fountain of ancient knowledge and wisdom. He has constantly brought these issues to the fore in, as Rosario was mentioning, his different roles in government, in the ministries, throughout both federal and provincial governments. It's the kind of knowledge and depth and anchorage that you would hope our government and our decision makers would have. And I find the same depth and anchorage in this book. I would have never thought that my friend Michael would write something so brief, first of all. If you speak to him, his language can be at some times polysyllabic, shall we say. But the clarity with which you pierce through all the noise of so much of the past centuries' bafflegab and bring us back to some of our heritage and some of the rebirth that is possible in civilization. That mere idea that is something that we can cull and sift through in order to create our own future, as opposed to simply looking at the idea of progress. It's a magnificent thing to be able to distill out of all of the learning that you've achieved, both here in Canada, in Oxford, and in government. So thank you so much for writing it. It's a wonderful piece. And it's filled with images. History is so difficult. Archaeology, art history, so challenging to make sense of. And what Michael tries to do is he takes so many different golden threads and tries to make images of them, tries to connect different aspects of history and civilization specifically. And one of the best ways he does that is he tries to personify them. So he takes a look at different kinds of humanity. What was humanity before civilization? If we're going to identify what civilization is, what it's good for, what we should be taking from it today, we need to identify what it looks like. How does it manifest itself? And so he takes a look at the kind of people we were more than 10,000 years ago, the Paleolithic humanity, the Paleolithic man who painted wonderful cave paintings in Lascaux, for instance. Tries to identify what is that immediacy that we had. We obviously had art, but we weren't quite there yet. It's a wonderful image, the idea of this person standing in front of the cave painting as they're making it, what their world must have been like, and you evoke it so well. But then you turn around and you contrast that with somebody living in an ancient Turkish town called Çatalhöyük. Well, it was properly a city, I guess. And you talk about what their lives were like, the kinds of stories they told through what they've left behind. This is not just the immediate cave painting of a bison. This is a home, an actual home built on the graves of their ancestors, creating a narrative out of their paintings in their houses. I'd love it if you could help to illuminate that contrast between the Paleolithic human and the human that lived in cities, and specifically Çatalhöyük, being connected to the past and thinking about the future, and how that relates to your three main themes, which you've brought about throughout the book, which is clarity, beauty, and order. What is that kind of contrast shows? How does that illuminate that contrast?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. First of all, I'd like to say Baines is exactly right. We go back a long way, and of course we had the same person, same learned Latin teacher we shared sort of without actually meeting one another for many years. And then all of a sudden we did meet at Trinity College in one Freshers Week, and we both recognized one another immediately because we were both smoking pipes and nobody else was. So we go back a long way. Yeah, so civilization, that word civ, something about living in a city, being a citizen, living in a single place, suddenly rooted in somewhere in place and in time. And this is the distinction that I wanted to draw between Paleolithic man and civilized man. And before I get into the difference, I wanted to say very clearly, or at least imply as clearly as possible, that contrary to what a lot of us have liked to think or have been told, that the distinction isn't one associated with technology. A lot of us were brought up, maybe in history, in high school or something, hearing about something called the agricultural revolution. This isn't a real thing. First of all, this notion of an agricultural revolution, this is a Marxist idea, the idea that the mode of production changes and therefore society changes. And that is true in the modern era, but in the sense that industrial life is very different from agricultural life, and that yes, it is true that there was some kind of pre-agrarian life and then there's an agrarian life, but that distinction or that shift is not what caused civilization. What I argue, and I'm not actually an archaeologist, but I'm basing myself on many important anthropological and archaeological arguments. The distinction goes the other way, that people decided to settle first, and then agriculture grows out of that because it was, necessary for whatever reason, because people had decided to settle down. Why did they settle down? Well, contrasting the material culture, the art and art and painting of two important periods in our history, you can see that Paleolithic art evokes motion, movement, energy, but not stability and not permanence. For instance, the pictures of the bison running or what have you, they're very beautiful. They are accurate. They look like bison. But the important missing pieces, sometimes, well, actually almost always, they don't have hooves. Or there's no landscape ever. There is no Paleolithic landscape painted anywhere. There's no Paleolithic sun, moon, stars, mountains, trees, nothing. Nothing to indicate a place or time.
So just disjointed.
Yes.
Kind of the moment rather than the narrative.
That's how it looks to me. This suddenly changes, though. And you have, in the world's first settlements, they take shape in the Near East around religious sites at places like Göbekli Tepe, it's the name of a little village in southern Turkey, or Çatalhöyük, also in Turkey. And what happens is the settlements have sort of art, wall art within them. And the art is suddenly depicting people standing on a sort of landscape, hunting a wild boar, the sort of equally energetic scenes as a Paleolithic, but suddenly we have a narrative. We have a picture of people cooperating, doing something. It's telling a story. It's not particularly attractive by our standards, and I would argue that it's perhaps less beautiful than Paleolithic art, but nevertheless, we have a story which we are still able to interpret, and the same sort of energy and vitality and scenes of human cooperation and so forth. What Robert alluded to with the settlement at Göbekli Tepe is that the very earliest settlements, houses in what is arguably the world's first city, Çatalhöyük, you have the same families living in the same dwellings, burying their ancestors under their proverbial floorboards in the sort of underneath the house for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, this continues without interruption. And the walls, the art on the walls would be, we can see from the archaeological evidence that it's regularly taken off and repainted exactly as it was over the course of 1,000 years. The family hearth, the furnishings, and so forth, everything is removed every about 150, 200 years and put right back exactly as it was. So this is a scene of stability, rootedness, and ultimately it's connected. It's clearly suggesting something like a shared past represented by a connection to ancestors.
And perhaps a shared future.
Right. So this is a new sense of time and place that has arisen, I think, in terms of evolutionary history quite suddenly. And it's this change of outlook, this change of idea that we belong somewhere, that we have a past, we have ancestors, that gives us a sense that we will also have a future and that there is a kind of continuum of time. And this is the...
Connect that as well to your other themes that you've brought out, that you've chosen of clarity, beauty, and order being main hallmarks of civilization. What does that continuity, that sense of community, how does that help to burnish these ideas that you've brought out?
Right. So what I wanted to say, I felt that I needed sort of some convenient shorthands of discussing how we recognize the difference or how we would describe the difference. So clarity, beauty, and order. If you look at something like the interior of an Egyptian Old Kingdom tomb with the images of the king or whoever is inside, with the hieroglyphs and the structure of the whole thing, what do you see? You see an image of the clear presentation of language, recording facts about the life and times of the person or about dynastic history, what have you. You see images of people going about their work, tomb figurines, especially, people washing jars or whatever it is that they're doing, just ordinary tasks. And you see the depiction of nature, animals and people interacting, geese flying through reeds and so forth. So you have a sense that people can understand and depict and explain the world to one another because they see it clearly. They see it as it is. And you have a sense of harmonious proportion. Everything is depicted beautifully and proportionately. The sense of measurement and mathematical rigor, and the sense of order in nature. That there is a sort of that there are observable patterns in the world that suggest how human beings and animals and plants sort of live and interact together. So those are the three things that I see in the art produced by civilization, but you can also see it, you can see these things in language, the mathematical formulae, theorems, what have you, or in music, or in a good sort of well-ordered household or that sort of thing. These are the sort of rubrics under which I discuss the fruits of civilization, and the opposite, how things have deteriorated in the past. So, I think that there are other ways that we might have looked at it. For example, religion, which is obviously extremely important as an anthropological phenomenon, that falls under order. There's a sense that there is an unseen order to the universe, but nevertheless an order. So I try to organize everything that I want to talk about civilization under these three headings.
And they're often very tied together as well. In almost every image that you bring forward, whether it's a piece of literature, art, or just a product of the mind, you're always showing how they're tied together. And of course, order helps that. But the overarching stability and the aspect of institutional stability is something that you bring about again and again. And it is of great use, I think, to those of us who are trying to investigate what's going wrong today, or what could be seen as going wrong today. And as you go on in the book, of course, you do, of course, address modern humanity and some of the essential characteristics that have changed in the 20th and 21st centuries. You identify that so many things have been lost with that sense of civilization for us. You wonderfully evoke Tocqueville and Hannah Arendt and so many others who talk about atomization, losing your sense of place. Whatever intellectual merit there might have been in trying to deconstruct the world and to create counter-narratives or personal narratives in favor of that kind of introspection seems to have just cast us aside into a world of the hurly-burly tornado with no way to stop it and no real understanding of where we're going or where we've been. I'd just love to talk to you about that. How did you see that transition when you were looking at it through the lens of clarity, beauty, and order? That change from Chateaubriand man to the modern world. It's a long part of your book, but I'd just be interested in any other particular, the most striking developments that you found of this change.
I'll give one important example that really sort of crystallized it for me, which is the abstractness of modern art. You think of the art of Picasso, or but of course everybody will have a different sort of image when you think of modern art. But it's very easy to criticize modern art as being something like ugly or somehow incomprehensible, or what have you. And I think a lot of, online there's a sort of trad movement that likes to insist that everything has to be sort of beautiful, and what they mean by beautiful is that it has to be attractive. So my vision of what beauty is, based on sort of looking at ancient civilization, it's not so much what is attractive, although attractiveness is sort of like a byproduct of it, that it's proportional, it is harmonious, that it is clear in the sense that it's an accurate depiction of the world, but it's based on a sense of proportion. And you see this both in the depiction of people and animals and so forth, as well as in architecture, that there's a sense of symmetry. Okay? So that all goes away in starts to go away in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And what really does it in, though, was were the Einstein's theories of general and special relativity. Now everyone's going to hear that and say, "What on earth are you talking about?" Well, what happened is that artists, to begin with, are in general very sensitive to what we now call physics. And again, this might sound strange, but it's true. The sense that the structure of the universe has some kind of order to it, or that it has a harmonious proportion, will very much influence how you depict it. And therefore, very, very ancient people were you think of someone like Pythagoras, who viewed the world as a sort of that everything could be explained by numbers. Why? Because the numbers express proportions and relationships amongst different things. Right? Nothing has come along to be more disruptive to that idea than Einstein's theories. And again, Einstein was actually a determinist. He actually believed in an orderly, sort of, well-structured universe governed by Newtonian laws and so forth. But relativity theory contradicted quantum physics, and yet both were demonstrably true. And therefore, the people who looked at this, the artists that sort of took this in, they thought, well, the universe is actually incomprehensible. The universe is a mess. It's a jumble. It's incoherent. And we are going to depict it accordingly. Now, I'm not really much I'm not really much of a mathematician. I don't understand physics really, but I think that that's true. And I think that one day we may be able to reconcile the distinction or the problem between the apparent truth of both relativity and quantum physics. And if they can be reconciled, we'll be back to this theory of an orderly, clear universe. I'll let you talk in a second. One of the most promising candidates to solve this discrepancy, and they call the potential theory that might resolve it, they call it the theory of everything, right? One potential theory of everything is string theory. I don't understand string theory at all, but the point is that string theory, at its most basic level, is fundamentally the Pythagorean universe again. And string theory is literally talking about strings, the same kind of strings that have harmonic frequencies as the ancient, the classical and medieval theory of the universe as a kind of stringed instrument. I think that that's just coincidental, but nevertheless, it could happen. I don't know, but something like that could resolve the problem. But to get back to the original question,
these theories inspired so many people to try to decouple their experience and their representation of the world,
right,
in a way that had never been done before. Of course, the futurists you have a huge scunner against for this. I don't want to get too far into it, but really the futurists were essentially, in a lot of their painting, trying to do the same thing that the prehistoric man were doing, just showing the instant without any connection to the past or just generally a predicted future.
Right. So it's one thing for Paleolithic people to depict the energy and vitality of animals and so forth. The futurists also wanted to show movement and constant change and sort of energy. But the futurists also had a loathing, they had a hatred for the past, which they wanted to destroy as supersede. I don't think Paleolithic man necessarily wanted to destroy the past or that he hated it or something like that. I don't see evidence of that. The futurists, for those of you who don't know, the futurists are basically they are the progenitors of every evil 20th century ideology. And that futurism, this idea of destroying the past and sort of sending humanity sort of forward into the future aggressively and as quickly as possible, in every European country in which they lived, they turned into the sort of, I don't know what the right expression is. They became Nazis in Germany, Bolsheviks in Russia,
Maoists.
and
Cultural
Maoists in China, and fascists in Italy. And of course, these different groups in Europe, they all claim to hate one another, and they fought street fights and so forth. But they had still fundamentally the same vision of the future and the same vision of the past. They hated the past.
So how did that challenge our daily life? How did that ruin what we've got now? Or shall we say, create the moment now that you quote from Livy, wherein we've got all of these problems without the will to solve them, because the solving of them would be so challenging and difficult?
It's a deep question. I mean, I think that it's very easy to look at oneself and to look at one's fellow human beings and easily decide that something is wrong, first of all. And I read a book long ago, I don't remember what it was, but the author contrasted two fundamental views of what is wrong. And one is essentially the sort of Judeo-Christian sort of Abrahamic idea that man is fundamentally not good enough, that he is sinful, has a tendency to evil, contrasted with the other one, the sort of the sort of Hellenic idea that man doesn't know enough. Well, I think probably in some sense both are true, but the solution to the problem that we arrived at, or that at least most people seem to have arrived at in the early 20th century, was that the problems were best solved by decoupling ourselves from a fundamentally evil or error-ridden past. And I say that this really took hold in the 20th century. It's actually much older than that. You have this chap, Francis Bacon, who was obsessed with this idea that somehow if we could all just sort of commit ourselves to a kind of a notion of evaluating knowledge based on its utility and how it profited us, that the future would be one of steady progress. Bacon reversed the idea of the old scholastics that antiquity was, as far as Bacon was concerned, antiquity was the youth of the world, and nobody would ever ask a young person for any advice. You would ask an old person, and we're older, so we should only look to ourselves. Obviously, this doesn't actually work in practice, and I think that we see it fundamentally failing in the 20th century. You have a theory, on the one hand, of this sort of future state of total equality and an absence of an absence of sort of capitalistic competition in the sort of the workers, the dictatorship of the proletariat in the Soviet sort of millennium, and then in the sort of the Nazi fascist one, you have the sort of the 1,000-year Reich and so forth. It's wrong to think of these things as somehow rooted in some sort of vision of the past. Obviously, both camps talked about the past a little bit. There was certainly a Nazi talking point about, sort of reviving folksy Germanness and sort of, the sort of ancestral spirit of paganism and so forth. That's all nonsense. Both are fundamentally visions of a sort of technological and in one case a eugenicist, scientific racist utopia, and both failed spectacular, albeit one took a lot longer to fail than the other. What I bring out in the book, though, that some people may find surprising, is that we are still in the grip, though, of this idea that some kind of some kind of future state or innovation or something new will come to save us.
That's the emphasis, the Baconian idea of progress.
Yes. And some reviewers thought that I was naive about technology or something. I'm not naive about technology. I used a computer to write the book. It's not, but the fact is that these things come at a price, and the price is that dislocation and deracination that confuses us, if that's the right word, right, about our place and purpose in the world, which was ultimately the origin of what I call civilization. And so there's a metaphor that I invoke in the book of the moon landing. Actually there are two. One is the nuclear bomb. The other is the moon landing. The nuclear bomb is an example of a triumph of technology which can, nevertheless just sort of kill all of us in an instant. And that, I think that's a kind of disquieting idea, but that's technology. That's progress. And the other is what was the other one?
The moon landing.
The moon landing. So the moon landing is another triumph of technology, and I talk about how the moon landing represents mankind going as far from our home as we have ever been, and intellectually we've just never returned.
I do like that.
So that's what I mean about the displacements and the dislocation and the sort of we need another D word, but the decoupling of people from place and time.
I did love that image of everybody's seen that image of the moon landing, looking back at Earth and seeing the Earth rise. And Carl Sagan, of course, used a different photo, I think, from Voyager going past Venus or something like that. And of course, Earth is just the pale blue dot. And sometimes I think our modern world does make us feel that way, that we are so far away from our home or where we thought we felt at home. Our history, a sense of belonging. That seems to be a pervading theme in most media, in most of our movies, our narratives that we have today. And that is terrifying, I think, for most of us. And whether it's the fault of the futurists or not, I can't be sure, but it's clearly caused such a challenge for all of us here. But Michael has some bright spots in his book, you'll be glad to hear. And that whole lesson aspect, what can we learn from history, and some of the discussions that have gone throughout it, and some of the rising and falling of the breadth of civilization. So many cities have just risen and fallen, taking some of the best elements distilled from those ideas. And Michael beautifully recounts so many of them. And rebirth is really one of the great themes and one of the hopeful elements of the book, despite the tirade about the 20th century and part of the 21st. And I'm just curious that if you're talking about this engine of rebirth, that civilization is a constant rediscovery and a rebuilding with the building blocks of the past and helping to build our character from those of our forebears. I'd just love to know a little bit about your journey in making that discovery, pointing that out. Where did you first come up with the idea of rebirth as a great theme for how to recover some of the challenges that we're in?
That's an excellent question. I want to also pick up on one thing that you said earlier, which was this idea of the sort of dystopian media and the sort of the vision of the future that we now have that's very different from the sort of technology. So both can be encapsulated in the sort of the cycle of films that came out in the early 80s, the original Star Trek films. Now, this is a very different kind of vision of a technological futurist society in which a Vulcan goes into the warp drive to to sorry, my wife is looking at me here. He goes into the warp drive and he dies, and then he comes back to life, and then the other Vulcans find his sort of sarcophagus and grave clothes, and he comes back to life. So ultimately, the message of this is that in the 23rd century, even Vulcans are Christian. Okay? Just chew on that for a moment. So this is a vision of a technological futurist society that nevertheless still welcomes contemplation of metaphysical questions that we've always had. Okay, this is not the society that we now live in, right? It's not. So we've gone from the sort of the height of the sort of Reaganite Thatcher era of the sort of the total triumph of Western Christianity, in which even Vulcans are Christians, to something completely different now. And yet, I think all of us are old enough to remember this, the films, I mean, and that this story of rebirth is one that has a kind of, I think, a universal appeal, even for Vulcans, and that you can find it throughout history.
It's a recurring myth.
A recurring myth. Now, in high school teachers will talk to you about the Renaissance, remember, as though there was, I don't know, only one or something, or that there was only one important one, or only one time at which civilization collapsed. And let's face it, the Western Roman Empire, that was indeed a collapse of civilization. It was fashionable in the 1970s or whatever to think of it as some kind of different thing, but it was a genuine collapse. And this kind of collapse and the thing that we call the Renaissance, or the kind of thing that we call it, this has actually happened many, many times. In fact, it is the rule. Progress is not the rule. A cycle is more like the rule. So
obviously, you picked up on this.
Yeah.
But are you really saying your first inspiration was Star Trek IV, A Journey Home, or whatever it was called? Where did you first come upon the inspiration?
Where did I first come on?
I mean, when did you start? I mean, was it Gibbon, or where was it that you first really... You've obviously been doing most of your doctoral work on Iran and Persia.
Yeah, well, Iran is a good example because you have, unlike in the West, in sort of the Mediterranean world, you have one political order that arises after the Bronze Age collapse. We'll get back to the Bronze Age collapse in a moment. But you have one great political order that takes shape, and that's the Roman state in the West. And then that collapses. 475 is the date when 476. Sorry, and that's conventionally the end. We can talk about a kind of downward slope for a while, but that's the end of Roman. That's the end of a Roman polity, and yet everyone afterward is trying to create, or some kind of sort of trying to associate themselves with this state, and the adoption of Western Christianity is associated with this sort of prestige of the old empire, and you still have this fellow in a white cloak, still living in Rome, who sort of carries on the the imperial legacy within Christianity, and he's, we still have this guy, he's called the Pope now. But the point is, in the West, there was only one such order. Much, much earlier, and in other parts of the world, you have something more like a succession of empires and states. And in Iran, you have 3 before the coming of Islam.
And most of Mesopotamia as well.
Yeah, and much earlier than that, you have many, many, many more in Mesopotamia.
I love it when you highlight all of the simple symbols of power and the titles and the pastimes, the depictions of themselves. They're all based on what they're trying to emulate.
Right. So that's the other key to the book, is that what we call civilization, it doesn't have a basis, as we say, in sort of looking into the future. It spreads and it continues by its rootedness in the past and by each successive iteration of people trying to imitate what came before. So the 3 successive Persian empires, the Iranian empires, the first one arises because Cyrus, the Persian king, conquers Babylon. The city of Babylon is already very, very ancient by that time, and it's kind of dilapidated. The religious cults have fallen into ruin. But what does he do? He restores all of them, and that's you find this in 2 interesting places. One is the so-called Cyrus Cylinder, which is often misconstrued as a kind of universal human rights document. It isn't really, but what it is the rehabilitation of local indigenous religions. But
if I may, in an interesting echo of that, I believe that cylinder is now in the
it is in the UN, yeah,
in New York.
Yeah, well, I'll let them have that, but I mean, it's not really true. But it
proves their point.
It does, in a sense, prove the point. But the other interesting thing that this crops up in is the Bible, of course, because Cyrus is the great patron of the Jews, who sends them back to the Holy Land out of captivity and orders the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So what you have here is the world's first great international empire, which is founded on the idea that it has superseded everything that came before, that has incorporated within it, and it rests upon a very broad and deep foundation. And the language used, for instance, within the Cyrus Cylinder, it quotes from and invokes sort of Mesopotamian creation myths that are more than 1,000 years old. So this would be like, this would be like the Americans conquering Canada and proclaiming some sort of great edict of toleration with language drawn from, Alfred the Great and the Venerable Bede or something like that. I mean, to put that into sort of chronological perspective. So the imitation, though, and the cycle of collapse and rebirth, though, it's actually much older. I think that Iran is a great example, though, because after the 3rd incarnation of the empire before the coming of Islam, the Arab conquest sort of snuffs out the indigenous dynasty, but then even then it comes back, and that the Abbasid Caliphate and what we call or what is conventionally called the Golden Age of Islam is really just the 4th Iranian empire, and it has almost the exact same borders, as the original Persian Empire, and it rests upon much the same kind of ideology, albeit in a kind of Islamic garb. But even in that case, they're looking back on the previous Roman and Persian leadership of the Near East and imitating
and literature,
culture, architectural styles. So again, if that isn't a a renaissance, I don't know what is. But also, I'll leave you with the final thought on this topic, is that the revival of civilization that occurred under the Fourth Iranian Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, that's when all the Greco-Roman heritage that was available, Sasanian literature and Sanskrit texts, that's when they were put into Arabic, and they came in many cases from Greek through the Syriac language into Arabic, and it was that interest in the original Greek texts that provoked the revival of learning, or a revival of sorts, in Byzantium, Constantinople, and the Eastern Roman state. And it's that interests a fellow you may have heard of. His name is Charlemagne. He had a friend by the name of Alcuin, an Englishman from York. They heard about this revival of learning that was occurring far in the East, and they thought, well, maybe we should do that. And that's why we still have Latin literature, because it was all they sort of paid huge sums of money to
scour the countryside.
Exactly, from manuscripts and so forth. And then there's another guy you may have heard of, far off. It's a very remote, very sort of rainy, foggy place called England. A guy by the name of Alfred, King of Wessex. He had a buddy with the unfortunate name of Asser, a Welsh bishop by the name of Asser. They heard about what Charlemagne was up to, and he thought, well, maybe we should do the same thing. So ultimately, and that's the sort of the House of Wessex. Alfred sponsored this sort of huge translation movement of Latin literature into Old English, and that sort of trained up a bureaucracy and what eventually coalesced into the Kingdom of England. But ultimately, at the root of that is this sort of series of what I'm describing is a series of people imitating one another across time in waves, and it begins. I mean, this sort of wave begins with the Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, which itself is a reincarnation of three former Iranian empires, which rest on a much older Mesopotamian tradition of monarchy and empire, and so forth.
But I did want to ask just one last question, which has to do with rebirth as well. You've got a constant reference to Confucius, of course. Confucius was all built on rebirth, and I never really tied all that together. But how much that affected China over the centuries and millennia, and I just wanted to know what you thought. You do mention China in the work about the future, about the rise of China, and how that might be affected by this idea of rebirth.
Right. So Confucius is the big hero of the book. You probably thought it was Spock or somebody, but no, it's Confucius. Why? Because Confucius comes at sort of the end of a period of dissolution and breakdown of something. I'm not entirely sure what, but it's a breakdown that in Chinese historiography is called the Warring States period, which is, as the name suggests, a kind of period of violence, but it's also a period of great intellectual sort of fervor. He comes at the end of it, and what he's trying to say, Confucius, by the way, was a bureaucrat. He was not, unfortunately, he wasn't actually very successful as a bureaucrat, but he had kind of following of people who liked him and who wanted to listen to him, and whatever he had to say is sort of memorialized in what we call the Analects, and it's probably, much. The sayings of Confucius are probably sort of much digested and probably reinterpreted. There was probably maybe a period of oral transmission. But in any case...
They were the high point of Chinese culture, constantly returned to and refreshed.
Correct. And why was that? Because Confucius is looking back to this state, an old Chinese state called the Zhou state. At the high point of this state, Zhou is spelled Z-H-O-U, and the so-called Duke of Zhou, who was a kind of regent for a younger king, he epitomized what Confucius thought of as a sort of the conduct and outlook and manners and what have you of a civilized man. And this was the high point. The high point was far in the past. And Confucius didn't necessarily have very much to say. I mean, the Analects are not especially long. You can read them. It's altogether, I think they're much shorter than the New Testament, for instance. And they don't form what I would call a narrative, but they are sort of snippets of wisdom that embody this sense that right conduct and virtue are to be found by looking in the past and by modeling ourselves on the examples that we find there. And in Confucius's vision, nobody was better than the Duke of Zhou. It's astounding to think about the inertia that this idea had. And this is why Confucius is the hero of the book, because he embodies this idea.
Wave after wave.
Yeah.
Kept using him and his thought.
Right. Now,
except for Mao.
Well, right. So China was conquered repeatedly. In fact, China has been ruled by foreigners from the steppe more often than not. But what happened, and Iran went through much the same kind of thing, although not as frequently as China, that the conquerors always adopted the Confucian way, that they could not escape the inertia of the Confucian philosophy. The Qing Dynasty, the last to rule China before 1911, were of Manchurian origin. They were not ethnically Chinese, and yet there was no more vehement defenders of the Confucian ideal than they. The Emperor Qianlong of the Qing Dynasty, is a Manchurian fellow. There may have never been a more learned person ever in the whole history of the world, but he was a Confucian, although his ancestors would have lived on the steppe, living in tents, moving around from place to place. When they arrived in China, they could not escape the gravitational pull of Confucianism.
The zeal of a convert.
Correct. Now, all of that obviously changed in the 20th century. Now, I don't want to be accused of carrying water for the Chinese Communist Party, because I'm not. But what I'm saying in the book is that there has been a revival of Confucianism in recent times. Not just Confucianism, but of all religions in China, especially Confucianism, and probably secondarily Buddhism. Taoism is up there too. Even a kind of indigenous Christianity. But Confucianism is at the center of this revival. Why? Because at a certain point after the Cultural Revolution, which was disastrous, the grave of Confucius, for instance, was ransacked. Mao rejoiced that it had been desecrated, for instance. But this has changed. The public attitude has changed from an officially atheist, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, communist regime. The attitude to public religion has fundamentally changed. It took a long time, but it happened. And if there's anything good that can be said about about Xi Jinping, for instance, it is that he has welcomed this sort of revival. He has encouraged it. He's publicly advertised his interest in Confucianism.
Is that good for us? Perhaps.
I think it's equivocal, and I think that, or problematic. Part of the problem is that the Chinese revival is attended by an increase in the power of the state to surveil and control its citizens. If you think about the sort of social credit, I don't know what it is, pilot project, I'm not really
Black
sure.
Mirror.
Right, I'm not really sure how prevalent it actually is, but whatever its extent, the social credit project, surveillance system is not communist, it is not Marxist, it's fundamentally Confucian, which is, I think, quite a paradox, because it rewards you points for doing things like visiting your parents, spending time with your family. It doesn't give you points for, wearing your Mao hat or, reading the red book. It's not like that. It's fundamentally a kind of Confucian hierarchy of virtuous conduct, but the surveillance aspect of it seems to me to be pretty reprehensible and non-Confucian. But it's there. But for my outlook, from my point of view, I would say that this is a challenge to us in the West, because our own moral outlook and the vision of a good life or of a good society, it lacks. These things now lack a center or a foundation or any kind of sort of metaphysical support, metaphysical justification.
Center cannot hold.
Right. So everybody will claim to believe in human rights, as we all should. But I mean, human rights is basically a kind of the discourse of human rights, the discourse of the rights of man and sort of what we call small L liberalism. These are fundamentally Christian ideas that only make sense only fully make sense if they have a metaphysical justification. If you don't believe that, it's one thing to assert that we are all equal and then just simply to leave it at that. But it's another thing to say we are equal because, we are all created in the image of God. Or that, let's think, that you should behave in a certain way because, some sense of human nature requires it, or that there is a sort of ontological reason to do so.
Kantian imperative, or
right. So I think we've lost. Well, I can demonstrate that we have lost that. It's very clear, and it is good that we still assert these things. In a sense, like Spock, we are all still Christians, whether we like it or not. But without the justification, what I argue in the book about China is that the risk for us is not that Beijing somehow rules the world or poses some kind of economic or military threat to the world. That's not what I think the risk is. The risk is that our own past, our own ancient past, gets a better hearing in communist Beijing than it does here.
So our next book will be building the center back up for for civilization. That'll be the next book, I suspect. Michael Bonner, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Please, everyone, give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
Yeah, terrific. A wonderful book, which is on sale at the back of the room for an extra $100. I'm sure he'll be persuaded to sign it. But thank you so much for a lovely evening, and I hope that many of you will have questions to ask the author.
Thanks for
afterwards.
coming.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Good evening.